Okay, and we're live. So just as a reminder, this call will be is being recorded and will be posted online. And take it away, Nick.
Thank you. Let's see. So first of all, next meeting. Today is June 4th. 2 weeks from now would be June 18th. Are there any concerns about that time slot, or same time in 2 weeks, basically? June the 18th.
I'm not going to make it, but feel free to go ahead anyway.
Okay. Any other conflicts at all? Okay. All right. Why don't we go with that for now then? Let's see. Well, we have a couple different topics for today. I think we have one discussion from Ilya on Web Vitals and potentially two different things from Annie on frame timing and single page apps. And then if we get to it, if we have time left, Nicholas wanted to talk about page visibility as well. I would say, why don't we get into it? Ilya, do you want to kick us off?
Sounds good. All right, hold on one sec. Share my screen. All right, I think everyone can see that. So I think I'll actually just queue up the conversation for Annie and Michael. So I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of what the heck is Web Vitals. I'm sure some of you have followed the news. I'm sure many of you have missed some of the news as well because of all the crazy that is happening in the world. So I just want to paint kind of a broader picture of what it is that we're doing and hopefully provide a little bit of a lens for what are the focus areas that we'd like to see for this, maybe for this group and this the folks here in the foreseeable future. So first of all, Web Vitals. This is a thing that we announced a few weeks back on the Chromium blog. So this thing is actually composed of two, it's a program, and it has two major components to it. One is a recognition that at Google, and I think as a community, we've been evangelizing web performance for a long time. We've developed lots of really helpful tools and metrics and guides and all the rest. But we consistently get feedback from folks that we engage that it's also very confusing. There are too many tools and there are too many metrics. And they want more coherency and guidance. So the first commitment that we're making, at least as Google, is to under the banner of this Web Vitals program, to actually bring together our tools in a more coherent way. And what we mean by that is to converge on a set of metrics that we are going to be featuring and highlighting across all of these tools, as well as developing all the right guidance, the best practices, the guides, and all the rest. And also providing a more predictable update cadence, where it shouldn't be the case that, in June, we announced something, and then a couple of months later, another Google product stands up on stage and says, here's a new shiny metric that you should be optimizing for. So it's a lot of it is kind of internal cat herding to make sure that we're all bought in and aligned on that. And hopefully that helps the ecosystem as well, because it builds in this more predictable cycle for, I know what are the top things that I should be optimizing for, and when they will change. So that's the program, and we committed to roughly annual update cycle for these key metrics, which we're calling the core Web Vitals. So we've designated a set of metrics to be the core set, and we will be revving them on this cadence. Of course, this is our first loop around the track, so we'll see how well we stick to all that, but that's the intent. So speaking of metrics, for the 2020 set, we focused on three, which are, of course, familiar to this group because we've been incubating and talking about them for a long time: LCP, FID, and CLS. I think additive bit that we added here is we also providing guidance based on the analysis that we've done on what is a good and needs improvement threshold is. So in particular, and on the slide, you see that, for example, for LCP, we're saying, hey, you should really target your LCP to be below 2.5 seconds. We consider that to be a good threshold, and you should be targeting that at the 75th percentile. And we established similar thresholds for FID and CLS. Without getting too much into the details of how we arrive at these particular numbers, because I know many of you will have that question, we actually have a really nice document that we published that talks about the actual methodology of how we derived these thresholds. And it is based on both survey of some of the literature and past research that's been done, but also feasibility. So we looked broadly at what is actually possible on the web. So for example, we would like it to be that the web is instant and all pages render their content in under 1 second. But is that practically achievable today? And the short answer is not really. So we need to take that into account as well. And based on kind of a tug of war between all these parameters, we then dial in these thresholds, which may mean that in the future, hopefully, as the web gets better, we're able to become a little bit more aggressive. But that all of that is documented in the Web Vitals methodology. Also, I'll add that Philip and team, who's on the call here, have been putting a lot of work and effort into creating a lot of content around education and debugging guides, best practices for all these metrics. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend going to web.dev/vitals and just looking at a body of work that's available there. And of course, any feedback that you folks can provide would be hugely valuable as well. So that's from the Chrome side. From Search, you may have seen this announcement go out last week. Search announced that they will be evaluating page experience as part of the ranking signal. So this is also not new in the sense that there's been a number of initiatives that Google Search has driven over the years, things like safe browsing, HTTPS, mobile friendly. We all remember those kind of big movements. So the new update here is that we're unifying all of that under page experience as a unified, I guess, program within Search, and specifically calling out that we're going to be using core Web Vitals as the key health metrics for assessing user experience on the page, which is a big shift and a big difference prior to previous communications coming from Search about why web performance matters, because previously it was not disclosed which metrics site developers should be looking at. So this has been a welcome improvement from a lot of the early feedback that we've seen. So I think that's a really good outcome. The other bit is we've made a strong push. This is connecting back to the program and how do we actually align all of our tools. We made a big push over the last year and 6 months in particular to try and unify all of our tools such that when these things go out, developers are actually armed with the right tools and capabilities. So you see here all the different tools that we launched last week, updates to all the different tools. So things like PageSpeed Insights, Chrome UX Report, Search Console is able to give you a report on how you perform in Web Vitals. DevTools Lighthouse, we have an extensive blog post on web.dev that enumerates all of the different updates and specifics of what landed. So if you haven't seen that, definitely recommend checking it out. It's actually pretty exciting to see all these things come together and offer a nice tooling story. That's not to say that there isn't room for improvement. There's plenty, but nonetheless, I think we're hopefully we're delivering on some of the promise of helping developers unify and then actually get good results. Also, if you haven't seen it, Philip open sourced a library, Web Vitals JS library for collecting these run metrics. And it encodes all the best practices that we found to date. And this is how we measure these things in Chrome User Experience Report. So this is a production-ready library. We've already seen a number of projects and sites adopted, which is really nice. But even beyond just taking it as off-the-shelf sort of thing, we encourage everyone to just look at the implementation and see and just kind of sanity check the implementation to make sure that they follow the same patterns, because there are some non-trivial gotchas for some metrics like CLS and other bits. Yeah, so you can include that today. So all of that is great, exciting. I'm glad that we launched that, and of course, the day after we launched it, we already are having meetings about. So if we promised to deliver an update in 2021, what would that be? And while a year seems like a long timeline, it's actually not that much time, especially if we're talking about incubating new metrics or closing gaps in existing metrics. We need to start working on that right now. And that's what I know Annie and Michael and others have been thinking about. So this is one lens that we've looked at this problem through. First of all, I should preface this with the current 3 metrics are not perfect, nor are they complete in terms of measuring great user experience on the web, but they're a good start. And we hope to both expand the set of metrics and the types of things that we measure, as well as improve the quality and coverage of what we're able to measure today with existing metrics. And this particular lens looks at what do we have today and what are the potential gaps. So if you look at this table and look at something like LCP, we do a good job of measuring the initial page load experience, but what about rendering performance after that? That's kind of a blind spot. And of course, that as a user, in terms of measuring user experience, it would be nice if we had some primitive that was able to speak to that and say, not only did it render fast, but it also performed well, like smooth and didn't drop frames or whatever metric that we come up with. Also, SPAs is kind of a common theme that we'll come back to in a second. For FID, first input delay, responsiveness is a general theme that we care about. First input is, as we know, a particularly challenging spot for many sites today due to how pages are built, how JavaScript is parsed and executed and all the rest. But we care about input overall on the page, not just the first input. So a natural next step here would be to not only look at first input, but all input on the page. And how do we reason about that? For something, and then we can contrast it to something like cumulative layout shift, where we have in fact built it in a way where it's not just capturing the layout shift while the page is loading. It's actually capturing layout shifts across the entire lifecycle of the page as the user interacts with it, which is really nice because it provides us that complete coverage. But on the other hand, it creates a set of other challenges, like what happens when you have a long lift page? And maybe you're just accumulating small amounts of shift over time. In a way, you're kind of at a disadvantage relative to a page where you're periodically reloading. That doesn't seem quite right. We don't want these metrics to incentivize behaviors where people are reloading pages because it allows them to reset their counters. And there's probably better ways to think about it. And this just maybe I'm not sure if it's a good or bad example, but we don't count the number of dropped frames over the lifetime of the page. We talked about frames per second. Maybe there's some equivalence to this, and that's a space that Annie and Michael have been exploring. So in terms of these are all areas that we'd really like to improve on in the fall. Whether this makes it into the 2021 version of our vitals, I'm not sure. There's a lot of open questions here, but I just like looking at some of the work that we have done or we've discussed with this group. There's some areas here that I think we've already done some groundwork on, and maybe we could get them over the finish line. So things like LCP or post-LCP rendering performance. There's previous work on frame timing. Maybe there's an opportunity to resurrect it and do better on that front. Responsiveness, well, we have event timing, and actually event timing we just recently shipped in Chrome, and I'm really excited about that. But I'm not yet sure if that's sufficient to cover all of our use cases there or not. So there's some questions there. Normalization is, I think, an interesting open-ended question that we need to wrestle with. It's not specific to LCP. It's going to be a problem for any metric that captures a stream of events, right? The accumulating input delays or accumulating layout shifts or all the rest. So how do we reason about that? And how do we present that data coherently and consistently in all of our run tools? Nick, I'm sure you've given this thought in your products. It's a non-trivial thing, and I'd love to figure out some consensus on how to best reason about this and what actually resonates. How do we help developers make sense of such data? Finally, single page apps, as we all know, remain as a gap for us in terms of measurement. They don't have well-defined start and end points and transitions, unlike page navigations, which makes it really hard for us to reason about. RUM vendors have come up with framework-specific solutions, but we don't have a standard API for that, and that makes it really challenging for a tool like, for example, Chrome user experience reports to gather such data at scale, which makes it hard for us to reason about those things at scale. And it does create a blind spot where, depending on how you implement your single page app, your telemetry may look worse because you chose to implement a single page app. And of course, that's not an outcome that we would want to incentivize or drive. So yeah, in terms of priority areas, responsiveness, maybe event timing is the answer, not quite sure. Post-load rendering experience, something that we've done work on. SPAs, I would love to find some creative solution there, and normalization. So those are the four areas that we're really curious to dig in over the next year or years. It might take more than a year. And with that, maybe I'll hand over to Annie and Michael.
So
actually, I should ask if there's any questions.
Hi, this is Steven. I've got one comment is, yes, for sure, for us, SPA is, the most important one, and I'd be happy to help if there's any way I can help. Just a question is, it seems like you ditched TTI for input responsiveness, for responsiveness, input delay. Just wondering why.
So if I take that one. So time to interactive, there's basically like kind of two contexts in which can be used in the lab and in the field. I'll talk about the field first since that's really important. That's the ground truth for, whether the set is performing well or not. The big problem with using time to interactive in the field is what we call an abort bias. So time to interactive can take a very long time to compute. And often the user actually leaves the page before it's computed. So that bad experience is actually going to make your TTI look better. And so we're very concerned about that abort bias, which is why we started measuring first input delay. We know that the user is trying to interact with the page, and the page is loading. There's a big delay that stops them from being able to interact with it. So we were more directly measuring the actual user experience is how we felt.
Okay, thank you, Anne. But isn't first input delay depending on the input when the click happens or something? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you, for example, if you have a lab, when do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
Metrics are great if you can detect a regression and then, or if you want to optimize and remeasure. It seems that first input delay is dependent on the input.
Yeah, so that's why we actually did a study where we compared a bunch of different approaches to a lab correlate metric, right? There's max potential FID, which is just like the longest task. The one we ended up going with, total blocking time, is like if you subtract 50 milliseconds for that's not really affecting the user input. 50 milliseconds off all the tasks, like how much are the tasks blocking? We looked at a couple other different lab options, and we found that total blocking time, when we did a study that took like the same device in the lab over 10,000 pages, and then we looked at the data from the field, total blocking time was able to predict first input delay best of all the approaches. I think Wikipedia did something similar and came up with a different metric that worked better for them.
And could I follow on and add, total blocking time is defined in terms of time to interactive. So we stop adding the long tasks at time to interactive. So time to interactive just gives you the moment when the page is idle. Total blocking time tells you, well, how busy was it until that point? And so then it kind of approximates how long delay would have been. So it's more elastic as opposed to just having a single cliff.
Yeah, we have some studies on that. Basically, the way that TTI has that 50 millisecond tasks, and so you can imagine you had a task at 1 second, 3 seconds, and 5 seconds. And if it was slightly faster, like they're all 49 milliseconds, you'd have like no TTI. But if they're like that last one was 51 milliseconds, sometimes the TTI will get really long. And I know it sounds a little bit weird. Like I'm going to paste the doc that we did, like kind of a study on elasticity of the metric. Even though TBT is bounded by TTI, it's much more elastic in the lab. It doesn't have so many jumps. I'll paste it in the doc in the chat because it's a little bit hard to explain verbally.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
All right, maybe I'll move on.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, Michael is leading most of the work in this area, so he's going to present. But I just want to say, like, anytime people have feedback or questions about today's metrics, the metrics in 2021, the metrics we're going to do in 5 years, we really love to hear those and talk about those anytime.
All right, thank you very much. All right, hi folks. Maybe I'll take this moment. I've been sort of poking in on these meetings in my face, but I'm Michael, work with Annie and Nicholas, and so hopefully see you all around a lot more forward. Let me just cast. All right, so I think Ilya did a great job teeing off, but I wanted to spend some time diving a little bit deeper into the 2021 goals and how our team is thinking about it on Chrome speed metrics. And I want to start with interactions, normalization, and SPA Navs, and then later I'll present on sort of frame timing or smoothness on the web. So for interaction, I think Ilya already talked about this, but we want to move from just tracking input delay to an overall input responsiveness. And I'll show that in a second, as well as going from just the first input to all input on the page. So this is a little diagram our team worked on to sort of overview how we think about full input responsiveness. And so you can see on the left in the purple, that's input delay. This is the time from when the input event happens to when it gets dispatched and sort of all of the queuing that is getting in the way of beginning to handle that event. But really, the time it takes to process all of those event handlers is what the user is interested in. And then also the time it takes the browser to paint the next frame on screen. So at a minimum, that's what we want to handle for input responsiveness. And that's what event timing already presents. But really, it's even more than that, because that's the minimum time that it would take to respond to the event. But there could be a whole bunch of async work that's kicked off from the event handlers. Things like resource fetches, API calls, just queued tasks. And so at some point, all of that work is actually completed. And then the browser does all of the work it needs to present the final screen. And this is what the user would consider from the UX perspective as actually being handled, a response to their input. So like we said, event timing, which is shipping in M85, it's on its way. We're really excited about it. We'll report on input delay, processing time, the duration to the next frame for all long input events. And that's fantastic. We are also exploring the heuristics for trying to attribute all of those extra async tasks after the actual input. So things like resource fetches, fetch XHR, scheduled tasks. Like Ilya said, I think Nick and other analytics frameworks are doing a great job here already, and we could learn a lot from them. But even within the browser, there's other sort of interesting leads that we have, such as paints being able to attribute the tasks that led to dirtying the frame, and then perhaps even the event that was led to the queued task. So we can sort of, rather than going forward from the event and tracking all work, maybe we can go backward from the paint frame to try and attribute to where it came from. We do think it'll be impossible to be perfect, but we do want to capture user pain when we know about it. So that was talking about capturing all input responsiveness. But Ilya also talked about, as we go to capture more of page lifecycle events, we have a new problem, which is to sort of, as we cover more full page lifecycle, we want to carefully compare perf values alongside user behaviors. So as users spend more time on page, we don't want to have the pages that they spend the most time with or interact with the most to be judged to have the highest cost. Those are the best pages. Users love them the most. So here's some examples. So if we just sum up all input durations, as the user interacts more, there's more total duration or delay. And so obviously that page is worse, right? Clearly not. Or if we just average across all inputs, this is better, but it still means that the worst delays are hidden by all of the good delays. And of course, we could use percentiles to catch more of the worst case scenarios. But there's two different ways to sort of look at this. If we look at first input, we start aggregating across all users, all devices, different field like experiences, and sort of looking at the top percentiles there. But this is looking across all interactions. And so things that happen much later in the page lifecycle will behave very differently than the first ones. So we want to be careful there. And looking at the max input duration, this is good. This captures the worst case, but it's very inelastic and it kind of hides an overall picture. And so we probably need some blend of all of these. Cumulative layout shift, we also talked about, is also one of these full page lifespan metrics that already has some of these problems. And so when you look at long-lived sessions with repeated shifts, they might have unnaturally high scores. And so one idea is to apply time-based discounting so that you penalize later shifts less, but this might actually risk incentivizing lower page loads. So if a shift comes very late, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It really depends. We probably also want to make sure to separate layout shift scores for each sort of section or page transition, especially when we consider single page apps. And then perhaps rather than just adding all of the layout shifts across all of those transitions, maybe we actually need an average across each section, or at least a maximum. So these are all related. So here are things we're thinking about. We're looking at the total times these things take, the median in various percentiles, the maximum. We're also thinking about adjusted versus non-adjusted. So much like long tasks, we think that there's a budget to a lot of these things. And as long as it happens within budget, it's totally fine. And we want lots of interactions that are all within budget and that shouldn't count negatively. So we really want to look at the adjusted, sort of like the extra time that was above budget. And also compare those to sort of page loads, page sessions, so when the user switches to background and then back, or the total time spent in the foreground, because all of these things have an influence on user behaviors. So eventually, we hope to dig in and find which of these, or a blended set of these, give the best prediction for real page experience. And I think we could learn a lot from a lot of the folks in this room here, but this is something we're thinking about over the coming year. All right, so specifically single page apps and normalization. So I think we all know that it's uniquely important to consider SPA routing as you measure your metrics, because multi-page apps sort of get this for free, where attribution is easier to know based on what the user experience was. So you really want to measure perf metrics tied to specific routes or URLs for easier debugging. So how do we do this? So the goal eventually is to have really accurate heuristics or propose new platform primitives to accurately track single page app routing. But this is hard to get right, and we don't have a concrete proposal for it now. What we really want is real world data to help us inform our approach and to confirm whatever it is that we did it the right way. And we want to begin by asking developers to sort of annotate their pages. And we know that'll be hard to get full reach to ask all devs to do this. And so we want to work with SPA frameworks, routers, analytics providers to just enable reporting by default wherever we can. All right, there's a bit of a render issue here, but we want to try leveraging user timing. And we think we could do this without changing the spec. And so, we talked about at last meeting that folks wanted a custom color on their performance marks in the timeline. And we thought it wasn't something that needs a spec change. It's really a convention that you can add to the detail field. And so we think that there's something similar we could do here. If you report a particular measure with a start and end, but give us an extra clue that's a convention and not a standard, then maybe we could do a better job tracking and aggregating it in RUM metrics. And so I did promise not to make a specific proposal, but we would eventually like to capture the actual event that led to a navigation, not only to get the timestamp of the event, like that's easy to get, but also just to tie it, to associate the two, because we might need it to report frame timing or paint timing that comes after the navigation. So we want some way to capture that. We also might want to consider passing a promise at the beginning to help simplify how you resolve the end of a navigation. We really want to know the signal right up front when the event happens that this is a SPA navigation, and then still track the end, just because we might want to measure things during the transition rather than just accepting a measure after the fact. So these are not proposals, and we do think that it's a little bit weird to add to user timing a way to capture these. And so we're really proposing just using this convention for now. But these are things we'd like to capture eventually. All right, so how do we add this to frameworks or routers or analytics? I think a lot of us have found that it's pretty easy to track the start. A lot of the frameworks give clear signals here. And developers can typically define the end conditions for specific navigations, but it is harder to automate this in frameworks. So some frameworks, at least, classically, have been able to track async chains of work like zone.js, and some upcoming experimental things are working on like semantic boundaries for SPA apps, like React has suspense boundaries where you can load large chunks of async work and it will track progress and sort of load in all at once. Or we can sort of start tracking and then watch the UX for updates and sort of use a process that's similar to time to interactive, where we wait for the page to get idle. Sorry for the rendering issues, I'll fix these later. But so in my experiments with some SPA frameworks and tracking, I did find using an approach similar to time to interactive was very useful. So you can imagine counting whenever the UI gets updated, tracking the beginning of a SPA navigation, and sort of resetting the timer anytime a big update happens to a portion of the page that you're interested in. And then once things settle down, or another navigation or another interaction happens, then you go back in time and sort of update. Like this was the span where things were changing. Okay, and that's it for this topic. Hopefully, once we capture all of those, we'll get a much better view of the current state of things and be able to present more throughout the year. Questions?
Michael, thank you. This is Steven again. I work for Salesforce. I was just wondering, like, maybe it's a bit naive approach, but if we had an API, you know, for SPA navigation, that would sort of reset all the measurements, you know, that would re-trigger a pool for LCP for everything. Wouldn't that be sort of covering most of the use case? Like, in other words, if you had, if the framework, when they know, like every routing frameworks, when they know they're going to route to a new page or content, they would just call this new browser API, and that would reset all those measurements API. Wouldn't that?
Yeah, yes, we would like that, but we're worried about the way we introduce it. So it's a little bit harder with single page app navigations for one reason. Is when you do a top level navigation, everything on the page changes. You start from zero and you start loading, and so you can attribute more easily. With a single page app, it could be a partial load of the UI. There might already be an animation, there might already be work going on. And so it's harder to naively reset things like paint timing and track like the next contentful paint, because which part of the content is actually loading is a more difficult topic. So just naively resetting and then reporting the same metrics we track already might not necessarily work. We might need something a little bit more sophisticated. Second is, if we rely just on developer hints to reset time, we really want to make it capture sort of user experience. And so we want to be careful there that developers aren't just constantly resetting these things and it's not actually capturing adequate boundaries. And so that's why we want to get these developer hints to inform and to make sure whatever we come up with match both user experience and what the developer's perspective on this thing is. But ultimately, I think that is the end goal, is to really have more of the.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of reinforce something that you had said as well, which is you were talking about maybe offering a way to measure at the end, where you basically can say the start and end time, looking in the past for what the navigation was. But you pointed out that it can be useful at the beginning to also demark that, as you know, as Steven's bringing up as well. And definitely from a third-party analytics provider point of view, we like to know when things are starting as well, because we may want to turn on additional instrumentation that we wouldn't have normally had enabled, you know, because it's heavier or weightier or more intensive or whatever. So having some sort of way to give a hint at the beginning, I think, is very helpful from like a third-party vendor point of view. And then, yeah, trying to figure out the end, I think, is the hard point. We do it in Boomerang by looking at the network. I like the idea of looking at the visualization results as well, or some combination of that, or some sort of algorithm or whatever. But that part is the hard challenge for us to get right, is figuring out when did work stop? And in a world where multiple widgets are all interacting and ads are reloading and other things are happening on the page, we don't always get it right with our naive approach. Sometimes we do, and we have like exclusion lists to exclude certain things that the site knows aren't relevant, but it all gets trickier and trickier and trickier. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a very smart way for the browser to tell us, what its opinion is, or if it takes more input from each site to kind of help define the important parts to them or the unimportant parts to them for these types of navigations. But I think that's the meat of our challenge as an analytics vendor, and definitely something I would love to talk through a lot more about figuring out if we could do smarter things more automatically.
Yeah, if we had good metrics that give us your best guess, or give us, we can work backwards to see what were the heuristics that best correlated with those things.
Right.
But yeah, reporting at the end has all sorts of issues with abandonment and whatnot.
Right.
But reporting at the beginning and then updating at the end will have issues with the user timing API and the way it works now. And so we'll work through all of those.
Yeah.
For now, we would just want to track.
Yep.
Is that a question from Benjamin, or?
Yes, I have a question about, do you think it will be easier for implementers to think of this as separate and distinct from existing page navigation? That's the first question. Second question is, do you think it's easier for implementers to do the same thing? So for both web developers and for us as browser vendors and analytics providers, which is the easier path? Just want some commentary on that would be appreciated.
So, maybe I didn't catch it, but which is the easier path, and we're comparing which other option?
To reusing existing kind of navigation stuff. Because I noticed in your talk, you were like, we're going to reset here for SPA navigation. So I just want to broaden the conversation and think a little bit outside the box here, or is it better as we work on this to work on it as separate and distinct from our existing navigation and paint timing, etc.?
So I think that we as a browser are not going to reset anything, not yet, not until we know a lot more. But it's important when you think about normalization, when you're tracking, like when event timing API starts shipping and you start tracking all page lifecycle events, that you as for your own developer keep this in mind. And so it's for you to be able to demark these sections and be able to aggregate and normalize more fairly, if that makes sense. So in terms of, because of the differences in a SPA page transition, especially when it's a partial page transition, I don't think it's a clear cut to just like reset the metrics and re-report them. Is that fair? Anybody else have?
That was previously not decided in this group, I think, but I tend to agree with you.
Hopefully we learn more, and then we'll come back with heuristics. That's All right, thank you for the questions. I do have one more thing to present. So the other topic Ilya kicked off nicely was measuring smoothness on the web. And so pointing at frame timing. So this is a coworker that has been working on this and filed a issue under the frame timing API repo. But it's really more about tracking smoothness rather than just specifically frame timing. So the goal here is to track smoothness of scrolling and smoothness of animations. I think we all know why we want this. And how this proposal plans to address it is to track the number of drop frames, variation between frames, and stale frames. Maybe right at the start, I'll compare. The old frame timing API was more about looking at the event loop and checking whenever that each sort of iteration surpassed the budget and reporting at a frame-by-frame level for long frames sort of thing. This is a higher level sort of report over the lifetime of a particular animation or scroll event, how it did in aggregate. So let's explain. So a perfectly smooth animation would have every single frame shown at exactly the right time when it was expected, as you see up front. But of course, we know that sometimes there could be frames dropped. So you might have some shown, some dropped. But that actually, there's two different ways two different cases, even among dropped frames, that we need to be careful of. In the first case here, we have shown frame, drop frame, shown frame, drop frame at a very consistent pattern. So this is, rather than having, say, 60 frames per second, it has a nice steady 30 FPS. Whereas in case 2, there was a bunch of 60 FPS frames shown, then a big long section with no frames at all, and then finally returns to showing frames. If you just count the dropped frames over time, you'll actually see that they have the same number of shown, same number of dropped, so the average percentage, average FPS is the same. But if you start counting sort of variations or jank, in the first case, there's no real variation. You might consider it one variation if there was like 60 FPS preceding this, but if it was really steady 30 for the whole time, there's no variation. And that's what we label as jank. Whereas the other one, there was a steady frame rate and then a big jank, and that's one difference. The other is that you can track the total staleness or the maximum staleness. And in case 2, you had 4 frames of staleness. So this same number of frames shown, much different user experience. Sometimes not showing a frame is not a problem, actually, because sometimes there's just nothing to show. There's no update to give. So with this sort of pseudocode on the right, you could see a sort of RAF loop where actually the developer chooses to just skip every other frame. And so the run loop actually did yield, and it could have shown a frame. There just was nothing to show. This is fun. This is fine. This is still a nice, smooth experience. On the other hand, you could have a wrap loop that skips every other frame, but then has a synchronous blocking busy loop. And now nothing could have been shown. We don't know if there was anything to show, wasn't anything to show. It's still blocking, it's still getting in the way. This is still a delayed frame. Now this is what the API proposal looks like. The entry type changes from frame, from being named frame to being named animation. From the perspective here, scrolling, CSS animation, JS animations, these are all just types of animations. There might be some debate there, but it really is, they're really treated very similarly. So you'll have the start time of when this animation started, the average interval between frames within that animation. You know, this could change based on hardware. We're getting screens that have variable refresh rate. We have high refresh rate. We have animations that aren't meant to run at maximum refresh rate. And optionally, I think you have an array of all frame details on a per frame level, and we'll get into that in a sec, as well as attribution to the element that was animating or the ID of the animation at present. So this is a much higher like semantic summary on an animation as opposed to per frame details. If you do dig into the frames themselves, you'll have the start time of each frame, whether it was presented or whether it was dropped, the scroll delta, if there was one, or a user action, if this particular scroll or other animation was started due to user action. On the right, you have links to more detailed proposal, as well as discussion issues that have already been filed. Here's how that API might be used. So you have a performance observer of type animation, and you could just iterate over all of the entries at the end of the animation to count how many frames were actually dropped. You could certainly report more, but this is just counting dropping. Some potential extensions we're exploring is to support custom recordings. So each scroll, each animation would have its own perf entry that gets reported at the end, but you might also want to be able to sort of consistently take a time slice from the page and be able to sort of aggregate all animations that were within that time slice nicely. So this is just a convenience wrapper. I think you could easily polyfill this over the initial proposal. Another potential extension is to have attribution. Of course, folks will want this. And it's to make reported metrics actionable. It is perhaps difficult to be concrete here, but the proposal is to just have a string explaining best it can that would be sort of browser specific as to the reasons. And the possibilities could be, garbage collection, long-running event handlers, long-running JavaScript, expensive layout, style updates, etc. And there are various security and privacy considerations about what we can report and how. All right, I think that's it for the proposal. Thank you. Questions?
I like that the proposal comes with attribution out of the gate. It's always a good thing from a perspective of somebody looking at the metric later, is why and how could they fix it.
A proposal for an extension for attribution, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is fair to say that this is early sharing, but it's very important that we practice, and we have folks working on it right now, working through the thing. So, Ilya?
I'll let Jill
Yeah, I was going to say for previous APIs that we introduced with this pattern, the buffered flag option and the buffer that came with it were in the hundreds. So for this, it means that you probably only have a few seconds to start listening, right? Like, how big do you envision the buffer for this?
So I did gloss over it. I tried to talk about it a bit at the beginning. So unlike the previous frame timing proposal, you would not get one entry per frame, per animation, etc. You would get a report at the end of the animation about everything that happened during its life. So indeed, like if you're reporting details on every single frame, that might get large. But in general, you would just have the number of dropped frames, the average interval between. It wouldn't be that large. Perhaps a follow-on question is for things that have like an infinite timeline or a very long timeline, how would you report? And maybe you would do so every number of seconds, just have a progress report or cut it early, something like that. So there shouldn't be too many entries unless maybe you have just lots and lots of animations on the page. I haven't thought through that example, but it shouldn't be the case that you would be buffering a single frame for every animation.
Michael, you did mention scrolling a few times. How would that actually manifest in the timeline? So if a user scrolling down the page, what is the animation in this case? What would be the event that's emitted into the timeline?
What would be the event that is emitted into the timeline? I guess I don't know if it's per user input, but there is a subtype, and it would, hold on, let me pull it up again. So I guess at the end of the scroll, you would get a new performance entry of type animation with subtype scroll. And it would just still say that the start time was a certain time, the average interval between frames of that specific scroll animation, the number of frames that were actually shown, and then, or intended to be shown as defined earlier. And then you'd get more details per frame here. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, I think that, yep.
Yeah. It is interesting that unlike the previous frame timing proposal that considers the sort of main frame event loop, things like scroll could be handled on the compositor. And so you might actually get a different number of potential frames, or an actual different number of frames shown for an animation like scroll that is decoupled from the mainframe, even when mainframe is blocked. And so you might have a whole bunch of animations run in a different pattern, like a raft that's choosing to skip every other frame, and a scroll, and a CSS animation, and they might all have very different metrics, which is interesting.
Would we want to, speaking to that point, would we want to actually emit these things for every animation? So let's say everything's running smoothly, everything's great. Is this only bad stuff happened API, or is this everything?
I believe the proposal aspect is for everything. But that's an interesting question. Do you want to be able to confirm that things are going well, or is it equivalent to say there's nothing that's bad? Is it important to track surprising additions to things moving?
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of second order questions. So the first one, I guess, was motivated by, what is perhaps the overhead of measuring this and emitting for every single animation? Maybe some pages have a lot of those going on, to your earlier point. So would that be just a fire hose of data? On the other hand, if you look at something like long tasks, we only surface the bad stuff, and it can be a little bit hard to know, like, what about all the good stuff? Like, what's the ratio of good to bad, right? Should I just be accumulating? And this kind of comes back to the normalization bit as well. Like, is this once in 1,000 animations that's triggered this, or every animation triggering it?
Absolutely. I don't have intuitions yet about the overhead. I'll take that back to the graphics team.
I mean, I think the overhead is a little, not just graphics, because you're emitting JavaScript entries for everything. That seems too much overhead. So one possibility would be, like in event timing, to use some form of counts. So I guess you can define these events in a discrete way. We're already doing it because we're surfacing entries, and then you just count the number of entries you would have fired for everything and just fire the bad ones, something like that.
That's a great.
I think we have Ben and Alex in the call. I'd be curious if you guys have any thoughts or reactions from implementation perspective from other browsers. Does this make sense?
Yeah, you've already expressed my concerns about asynchronous scrolling and excessive overhead. I think those are my big things.
I guess we can certainly get more data on that and come back.
All right, thanks. I appreciate the feedback.
Michael, one more question. You linked, I think in the slide deck, has the current, what is the plan for frame timing? Are we planning to resurrect that? Is this a completely new proposal living somewhere else on WSEG? If I want to dig in, where do I go?
Thank you for the reminder. So we decided to file the issues within that repo, and because the original proposal hasn't had progress for a very long time. I believe it's dead. And this is enough related that we thought anybody who was previously interested in the old one is going to be interested in this new one. On the other hand, it is a little bit different, and it's evolved since initially, and so even the event entry type has changed and so on. And so what do folks think? I think there's some value to having it in the same home and some value into putting it elsewhere. Fresh start.
Would we still call it frame timing?
good question. So Drool calls it smoothness. I think the proposal right now is frame timing for scrolls and animations, and there is still reporting on the frame timing. It's just not every single frame of the page necessarily. So I think you could have a flexible argument either way.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on either the name or the location. I guess the more important bit is just to have a well-defined place where we can route folks. And also make sure that if we are reusing frame timing, then that we're navigating folks to the new proposal as opposed to kind of getting buried in the old discussions, because it is significantly different.
Yeah, I have because the word frame is so overloaded with iframes and JavaScript frames and whatnot. And because this focuses on animation time, like maybe it's worthwhile to rename to animation timing or something along those lines, where you're still reporting frames, but they are like, that's not the focus here. It's a means to measure smoothness or animation smoothness.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Can I also interject one more thing? I'm not sure whether this will allow you to see what's going on in another origin that you're not supposed to see or something like that. I don't think that's been mentioned, and it should be.
Yeah, I only briefly covered the implications to security. I think we'll want to cover more deeply, perhaps next time.
Or even more seriously, elsewhere on the system, like if you have a simple animation that's dropping a lot of frames, that might imply that you are the same user that was on a different website that also was dropping a lot of frames on a simple animation because you have, you're compiling in the background or something.
Fingerprinting.
Yeah.
So I do want to be mindful of people's times today. I know we're hitting up against the barrier right now. I want to thank everybody for presenting so far. I'm assuming, Annie, there was more things that you want to chat about for single page apps specifically as well?
Oh, right now we're focused on the user timing proposal.
Okay.
That Michael went over.
Okay, wonderful. So Nicholas, if we could move yours to next time as well, and somebody else had put backboard cache and row metrics on there. So why don't we just try to follow up with that in 2 weeks when we meet again?
If Benjamin's still in the room, I don't know, he might have left. Annie was meant to present, I presented, so everything that was meant to be presented was presented, just to clarify.
And I can reach out to him to clarify that. And thank you for taking, it looks like 7 pages of notes on this meeting today. So we've definitely discussed quite a bit. So thank you all. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.